Dive by Dr. Pat, leading innovation in fertility excellence.
We want to welcome you to the deep dive today. And, well, we are stepping right into a landscape that a lot of you might know intimately.
Yeah, very intimately.
Right. It's a space that is incredibly emotionally charged, financially draining, and frankly, where the biological outcomes are far from guaranteed. We are talking about reproductive medicine, specifically in vitro fertilization or IVF.
It really is the absolute definition of a high-stakes medical environment. I mean, when you just look at the raw statistics, the urgency of it becomes very clear. Roughly 1 in 7 couples struggle to conceive.
Wow, 1 in 7.
Yeah, 1 in 7, which is what pushes so many toward interventions like IVF. But the thing is, standard IVF, like the baseline process, it only yields a success rate of about 30 to 40% per cycle.
So that means if you're sitting in a clinic, you're often looking at a 60 to 70% chance of failing that specific cycle.
Exactly. The odds are tough.
And because the stakes are so phenomenally high, a booming industry has emerged over the last decade, offering what are known as IVF add-ons.
Right, the add-ons.
Yeah. These are extra procedures, extra medications, or specialized lab techniques that clinics offer. And they are often at an intense premium, promising to boost your odds of taking home a baby.
The adoption rate of these add-ons is just staggering. The data shows that more than 75% of IVF patients in places like the UK and Australia use at least one add-on.
75%?
Yep. Patients are routinely paying thousands of dollars out of pocket for these interventions because they believe it will give them an edge.
Which brings us to our mission for you today. We are unpacking a massive, truly groundbreaking systematic review and meta-analysis. This was published in The Lancet in June 2026.
It's a brilliant paper.
It really is. It takes a magnifying glass to 10 of the most popular IVF add-ons. But more importantly, we are going to look at how these researchers separated the actual scientific reality from a whole lot of aggressive marketing hype.
And to do that, well, we have to start with a rather uncomfortable truth about medical data in general.
Right, let's get into the messy part.
Yeah, it gets messy. If we look at the broader landscape of medical research over the past 10 years, estimates actually suggest that 20 to 30% of published medical trials across all disciplines might be fabricated, heavily flawed, or just generally unreliable.
Okay, let's unpack this because 20 to 30%, that statistic alone is staggering.
It is.
But in this Lancet paper, they point out that reproductive medicine is actually faring worse than that general average.
Much worse, yeah. The analyses cited in the paper suggest that up to 50% of randomized controlled trials in reproductive medicine are either unregistered before they begin or they raise serious trustworthiness concerns.
Up to 50%.
Up to 50.
I mean, when you are a patient making a $10,000 medical decision, the idea that half the data supporting that decision might be flawed is deeply unsettling.
Absolutely. So the researchers behind this Lancet meta-review instituted what is essentially a massive data purge.
A purge. I love that.
Yeah. They applied a rigorous standard using a relatively new tool called the TRACT checklist. And TRACT stands for Trustworthiness and Randomized Controlled Trials.
Okay.
So they started by casting a wide net, pulling in over 12,000 search results. Then they narrowed those down to 244 potentially eligible studies on these specific add-ons.
Right.
And then they applied the TRACT criteria.
And the result was sweeping. I mean, they explicitly threw out 72 of those studies specifically due to trustworthiness concerns.
Yep, just tossed them.
And the primary reason for exclusion was the absence of prospective trial registration, meaning the scientists running the study didn't formally register what they were going to look for before they started the experiment.
Exactly.
But hold on, if they just forgot the registration paperwork, the actual science happening in the lab could still be totally sound, right? Like, why throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Well, that is a common defense. What's fascinating here is that prospective registration is really the foundation of scientific integrity because it prevents a phenomenon known as shifting the goalposts or p-hacking.
Oh, p-hacking.
Yeah. Let's say a clinic decides to test a new add-on to see if it increases live birth rates. They run a trial with 500 patients. At the end of the trial, the live birth rates haven't budged at all.
Right.
The add-on essentially failed its primary mission.
So they have a negative trial on their hands.
Exactly. But they don't want to publish a negative trial. Nobody wants that.
Yeah.
So they start slicing the data. They look specifically at women over 38. No difference. They look at men with low sperm motility. No difference.
Just digging for anything.
Right, digging. Finally, they isolate a tiny subgroup, say women under 32, with a specific BMI. And in that tiny group, they see a slight increase in eggs retrieved, even if it didn't actually result in more babies.
Oh, I see. So then they rate the paper focusing entirely on that tiny subgroup, claiming the add-on is highly successful for retrieving more eggs in that specific demographic.
Precisely. They draw the bullseye around where the arrow already landed. If you do not publicly register your exact primary endpoint, like what you are measuring and who you are measuring it in before you begin, you leave the door wide open for researchers to manipulate the data after the fact to manufacture a success story.
Wow. And here's where it gets really interesting, because it is not just that they threw out, obscure studies from unknown clinics. When the Lancet researchers looked at previous Cochrane reviews,
And Cochrane is widely considered the gold standard for evidence-based medicine.
right, the gold standard, they found that applying this strict Track 8 checklist meant they had to exclude 49% of the studies those old Cochrane reviews had relied on.
Almost half. Almost half of the foundational knowledge base for IVF add-ons, even at the absolute highest levels of medical synthesis, just crumbled when subjected to a strict trustworthiness test.
That is wild.
In some cases, studies that had been formally retracted years ago for ethical violations were still being cited in recent literature as proof that these add-ons worked.
Unbelievable. So, all right, the researchers clear the fog. They sweep away all this unregistered, highly manipulated data, and we are left only with the rigorous, trustworthy science.
The good stuff.
Right. So let's explore what actually survived, starting with interventions that try to physically or chemically manipulate the implantation process. And I think the most famous of these is endometrial scratching.
Yeah, that's a very common one. This is a widely offered minor physical procedure. The doctor basically uses a small, flexible instrument called a pipelle to essentially scratch or intentionally disturb the lining of the uterus, the endometrium.
Yeah.
And this is usually done in the cycle just before the embryo is transferred.
Now, on its face, the logic sounds totally counterproductive. You are trying to convince a very delicate embryo to implant, so why go in and intentionally cause physical trauma to the environment?
It does sound backward.
But I've always thought of it like scuffing up a smooth wall with sandpaper. You have to rough up the surface just a little bit so the new paint will actually adhere.
That's a great way to think about it. And the biological mechanism follows that exact logic. The intentional scratching causes localized tissue inflammation.
Okay.
As the body sends immune cells to heal that tiny wound, the theory is that the resulting cellular environment actually makes the uterine lining more receptive to the embryo. And, when we look at the data that survived the trustworthiness purge, the evidence does support this to a certain degree.
Yeah, the meta-analysis pulled data from 19 trustworthy randomized trials, and it actually showed a small increase in the chance of a live birth.
It did.
The odds ratio was 1.20 with moderate certainty, so essentially a 20% relative increase in the odds of success.
Right, so it is not a guarantee by any means, but the rigorous data suggests a real statistically significant benefit for some patients.
That's actually pretty encouraging.
Yeah, it is. Now, moving from physical manipulation to chemical manipulation, we have an add-on commonly known as embryo glue.
Which is a very aggressive marketing name, by the way.
Very catchy.
It is. But it is actually a liquid medium enriched with hyaluronic acid. So the clinic places the embryo into this medium right before they transfer it into the uterus.
Right. And hyaluronic acid is naturally abundant in the female reproductive tract. The working theory is that bathing the embryo in a highly concentrated solution of it increases the viscosity of the fluid, basically helping the embryo adhere to the uterine wall and preventing it from being expelled.
Now, the paper gets pretty deep into the statistical weeds here when analyzing embryo glue. Specifically, it details the difference between fixed effects models and random effects models. Can you walk us through why that statistical choice changes the entire outcome of this add-on?
Yeah, this distinction is absolutely vital for understanding medical research. When researchers combine multiple different clinical trials into one massive meta-analysis, they have to decide how to blend the data. So, a fixed effects model assumes that every single trial is fundamentally identical. It assumes that a trial conducted in 2015 on 28-year-old patients with tubal factor infertility is mathematically identical to a trial conducted in 2024 on 42-year-old patients with diminished ovarian reserve.
Which completely ignores the biological reality of IVF. The patients are vastly different, the clinic protocols are different, the lab environments are completely different.
Exactly. A fixed effects model can create false confidence by ignoring those variables. A random effects model, however, explicitly acknowledges that variation. It assumes the trials are heterogeneous. It is a much more conservative, rigorous way to look at complex biological reality.
And this is the kicker. When the Lancet researchers looked at embryo glue using the fixed effects model, it seemed to show a benefit. But when they applied the more realistic random effects model, that benefit completely disappeared.
Just vanished.
Yeah, there was no clear effect on live births.
The certainty of evidence for embryo glue dropped to very low. It remains heavily marketed in clinics, but the most rigorous statistical models just do not definitively support it.
That is so important to know. Now, staying with hyaluronic acid for a moment, let's look at another intervention that uses it, but this time for the sperm rather than the embryo. It's called PICSI, or physiological intracytoplasmic sperm injection.
Right, PICSI. So standard ICSI is the baseline procedure where an embryologist visually selects a single sperm under a microscope. They're looking for the best shape and fastest movement, and then they inject it directly into the egg. PICSI adds a chemical selection layer to that.
You essentially let the sperm take a chemical test before it gets the job.
That's pretty much it. The embryologist places the sperm in a dish coated with hyaluronic acid. The underlying biological theory is that only fully mature, genetically competent sperm have the specific receptors required to bind to that acid.
Oh, interesting.
So rather than the embryologist just guessing, based on how the sperm looks, the hyaluronic acid chemically tethers the most mature sperm, and the embryologist selects from those.
And the data for this relies heavily on one exceptionally large, trustworthy trial out of the UK by Miller and colleagues. It included nearly 2,800 people.
A huge trial.
Yeah, but the results here are very nuanced. It did not show a definitive boost to the primary goal, which is increasing the overall live birth rate, but it did show a meaningful reduction in the miscarriage rate.
And that distinction highlights something crucial about embryo development. PICSI may not necessarily create a higher raw quantity of usable embryos, but by selecting sperm with presumably less DNA fragmentation, it appears to improve the genetic competence of the embryos that do successfully implant.
Meaning more of those pregnancies go the distance.
Exactly.
Which, for a patient, reducing the risk of a miscarriage after fighting so hard just to get pregnant, that is an incredibly powerful metric.
Absolutely. It's a huge emotional difference.
Okay, so we have explored physical and chemical interventions in the lab. But let's transition to whole body, systemic approaches, and some of the more complex genetic add-ons. Because when the researchers applied the Track the T checklist here, some of the most popular treatments in the world just fell apart.
They really did.
Let's start with acupuncture.
Oh, acupuncture. It is widely recommended alongside IVF. The proposed mechanism is that the insertion of needles at specific meridians increases blood flow to the ovaries and uterus, regulates endocrine function, and significantly reduces systemic stress, which, in theory, should optimize the body for pregnancy.
But the Lancet review found absolutely no clear effect on live births. And honestly, the story of how they arrived at that conclusion is a masterclass in why we need strict data standards.
It really is. When reviewing the literature on acupuncture, the researchers identified 13 separate randomized trials that all originated from a single hospital in China.
Okay, 13 trials.
And not a single one of those 13 trials had been prospectively registered.
Yeah.
When the Lancet reviewers attempted to contact the authors to verify the raw data, or just confirm their randomization methods or basic protocols, the authors ignored the correspondence entirely.
So they threw all 13 trials out of the meta-analysis.
They had no choice. You cannot build medical consensus on opaque, unregistered data from researchers who just refuse to engage in peer validation. And once those highly questionable trials were removed, the remaining trustworthy trials showed no benefit to IVF outcomes.
And what clarifies this even further is how the trustworthy trials were conducted, because they often compared real acupuncture, administered by trained professionals, to sham acupuncture.
Right, fake acupuncture.
Yeah, where needles are placed superficially or in the completely wrong locations, and the data showed no difference in IVF success rates between the real needles and the fake ones.
That sham comparison tells us a great deal about the actual mechanism at play here.
It points heavily to the placebo effect of forced relaxation. I mean, if you are enduring the agonizing daily stress of hormone injections, ultrasounds, and financial strain, and someone requires you to lie down in a dark, quiet room with soothing music for an hour, your cortisol levels will drop.
Yeah, definitely.
Your blood pressure will lower, you will feel objectively better, but the placement of the needles themselves is not altering the cellular division of your embryos.
Exactly. The psychological comfort is real, and it's valid for many patients. But from a strict evidence-based perspective, it does not biologically increase your odds of a live birth.
Which brings us to perhaps the most complex and heavily debated add-on in the entire field, PGTA.
Yes. Pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy.
Right. This involves an embryologist removing a few cells from a developed embryo and screening the chromosomes before deciding whether to transfer it into the uterus.
And the underlying logic for PGTA is incredibly compelling. The vast majority of early miscarriages and failed implantation cycles are caused by aneuploidy. Yeah. Basically, an embryo having the wrong number of chromosomes.
Right.
If we can screen the embryos in the lab, identify the genetically abnormal ones, and only transfer the normal ones, we theoretically eliminate the primary cause of IVF failure.
It makes complete logical sense. If it reduces your chance of a miscarriage on the first try, why wouldn't every single person do it? Like, why does the rigorous data challenge its routine use?
It comes down to the critical difference between the success rate of a single embryo transfer, which clinics heavily market, and the cumulative success rate of your entire IVF cycle, which is what actually determines if you take home a baby.
Oh, I see.
The trustworthy data does show that PGTA lowers the miscarriage rate on the first transfer. If you transfer a screened, euploid embryo, that specific transfer has better odds. But the data on whether it increases your cumulative chances from the whole batch of eggs you retrieved, that is highly unclear.
So why would that be? I mean, if you are weeding out the bad embryos, shouldn't your overall odds go up?
Well, there are two main culprits here. First, the test itself is not infallible. It can result in false positives, especially with what are known as mosaic embryos.
Mosaics.
Yeah, embryos that have a mix of normal and abnormal cells. The biopsy might pull an abnormal cell from the outer layer, leading the clinic to discard the embryo entirely. But studies have shown that some of those mosaic embryos, if transferred, can actually self-correct and result in perfectly healthy babies.
Wait, really? So with PGTA, you might be throwing away your only chance at a healthy child based on a false positive.
Exactly. You are discarding a viable embryo because the snapshot the test took was misleading.
That is heartbreaking to think about.
And furthermore, to perform PGTA, the embryologist has to physically biopsy the embryo, removing a piece of its outer layer. Then, the embryo must be frozen while you wait for the genetic results to come back from the lab.
Right.
The mechanical stress of the biopsy, combined with the freeze-thaw process, can damage or entirely arrest an embryo that might have otherwise thrived if it had simply been transferred fresh.
So you lower your miscarriage risk on the first transfer, but you do so by potentially depleting your total number of usable embryos through false positives and biopsy damage. You might win the single transfer statistic, but jeopardize the cumulative cycle.
Right. The robust data just does not support the routine, across-the-board application of PGTA for all patients as a way to increase overall live birth rates.
Okay, so we've covered physical, chemical, systemic, and genetic add-ons. Let's move into the final category of interventions explored in the paper. These are approaches that try to fine-tune the exact timing of the uterus or suppress the patient's immune system. And when subjected to the trustworthiness purge, these add-ons showed little to no effect.
Yeah, let's start with endometrial receptivity testing. The most common commercial version is the ERA test. The theory here is that every woman has a very specific, narrow window of implantation.
Right, this exact 12 to 24-hour period when her uterine lining is perfectly receptive to an embryo.
Exactly. So the clinic performs a biopsy of the uterus in a mock cycle, sends the tissue to a lab, and the lab analyzes hundreds of genes to tell a doctor the exact hour to transfer the embryo next month.
It sounds like precision medicine at its finest.
It is a beautifully constructed biological theory. But when we look at the high-quality, trustworthy, randomized controlled trials that actually put this to the test, adjusting the transfer time based on these genetic tests does not definitively improve live birth rates compared to standard routine timing.
Wow. So the biology is simply more adaptable and complex than a rigid 12-hour window dictated by a genetic algorithm.
Right, the body is smarter than that.
Moving to the immune system, we have add-ons like corticosteroids and intralipid infusions.
So the immunological theory of infertility posits that a patient's body might be recognizing the embryo as a foreign object since half of its DNA comes from the partner. and so it mounts an immune attack against it, utilizing natural killer cells to prevent implantation.
And to combat that, clinics offer corticosteroids to broadly suppress the immune system, or intralipids, which is essentially an intravenous drip of soybean oil, egg yolk, and glycerin, which is theorized to calm those natural killer cells down.
While the immunological theory is actively researched, the clinical application of these add-ons is just miles ahead of the data. The trustworthy evidence for corticosteroids and intralipids improving live birth rates is currently graded as very low certainty.
Very low.
The trials are simply too small, too few, or too fraught with bias to prove that suppressing the immune system in this way safely translates to more babies.
And perhaps the ultimate example of marketing outpacing science is PRP, or platelet-rich plasma injections.
This one is wild. This involves drawing the patient's blood, spinning it in a centrifuge to concentrate the platelets and growth factors, and then injecting that plasma directly into the ovaries or the uterus.
Yeah.
The marketing claims it can basically rejuvenate dormant ovaries or stick in a stubborn uterine lining.
But the Lancet researchers highlight a really sobering fact here. PRP was evaluated in a randomized controlled trial for the very first time less than 5 years ago.
It is an incredibly novel intervention. The few trustworthy trials that do exist are extremely small. Yet it is being aggressively marketed globally as a premium add-on for patients with diminished ovarian reserve. The rigorous evidence simply does not yet exist to support its widespread commercial use.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Because if you are navigating the fertility industry, you are exceptionally vulnerable. You are dealing with grief, exhaustion, and the profound desire for a child. When a medical professional hands you a menu of add-ons that sounds scientifically advanced, the instinct is to try everything.
Of course it is, but understanding the findings of this meta-analysis is a critical form of self-defense. This paper provides clear evidence that the vast majority of these costly add-ons are not proven to increase your chances of having a baby. Just because an intervention is commercially available does not mean the underlying science is sound or trustworthy.
Exactly. You could be draining your finances on a placebo, or in the case of something like PGTA or immune suppression, you could inadvertently be introducing new risks to your cycle.
Right. And to help bridge this gap, the researchers behind this Lancet paper have actually translated their complex findings into a highly accessible, free public resource. It is a tool called evidence-based IVF, and you can find it at unmlb.edu.au/IVF.
That's a great resource.
They designed this platform specifically to empower patients, helping them decipher the science and push back against unsupported marketing claims in the clinic.
So that is unmlb.edu.au/IVF. Look, science is an evolving process, and it is entirely possible that 10 years from now, rigorous trials will figure out how to optimize some of these interventions. But we cannot build the current standard of care on unregistered trials and shifting goalposts.
No, we can't. And if we connect this back to the broader landscape of our healthcare, it leaves us with a rather profound question to consider.
What's that?
Well, we just learned that enforcing strict prospective registration and trustworthiness standards invalidated nearly half of the accepted studies in reproductive medicine, even dismantling data relied upon by Cochrane reviews. If that degree of flawed, unverified science was hiding in plain sight within the fertility industry, how much of the routine medical care you receive in other areas of your life is built on a foundation of data that would fill the trustee checklist today?
Wow. That is a thought that should change how we all look at the medical advice we receive. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive today. Stay curious, ask for the data, and we will see you next time.
Leading innovation, fertility, excellence. Live by Dr. Pat. Leading innovation in fertility excellence.